He found a lost dog on the street and took it to his home without imagining what the real owner would be capable of doing. After a few months, when Charles and his adopted dog had already become inseparable friends, the man came across a poster looking for the dog, in which the former owner offered a generous reward, leaving him faced with the dilemma of whether to return his faithful friend or to save his own life, using the reward money to pay for the treatment of his serious illness. Night fell over the city as Charles Cooper, a lonely freelance writer, walked the deserted streets. Their footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk, accompanied only by the distant murmur of cars. A feeling of emptiness enveloped him, while the weight of loneliness seemed to crush him with every step. Charles was a man in his early 30s, with dark hair and tired eyes. Her face, once full of vivacity, now bore the marks of countless emotional battles. Loneliness was her constant companion. Away from relationships, Charles had built a wall around his heart. The emotional scars of past disappointments still burned, making him fear any form of human connection. He would rather retreat into his solitude than risk the pain of being hurt again. But what he didn't know was that soon, his life would find a new meaning. Charles's routine was monotonous and suffocating. He lived alone in a small apartment in the heart of the metropolis. The cold, impersonal walls were silent witnesses to his constant loneliness. The nights were filled with the lonely sound of computer keys as he typed his stories and escaped into a fantasy world that seemed more real than his own life. As he wandered the streets lost in his thoughts, something caught his attention. A soft, crying sound came from a nearby alley. Curious, Charles followed the soundtrack of melancholy, letting himself be guided by an instinct that had long since fallen asleep. As he approached the alley, his eyes met a sad and forlorn sight. A hungry dog was huddled in the corner. His sad eyes reflected the same loneliness that haunted Charles, seeming like an echo of his own soul, lost and abandoned. Empathy filled Charles's heart as he knelt down to approach that poor dog. His trembling hands stroked its dirty, matted fur, and he could feel the fragility of the animal in his hands. A gleam of compassion appeared in his tired eyes, and a new determination was born in his chest. "You are not alone, my friend," Charles whispered to the dog, whose sad gaze met his. "I also know loneliness, and together we will face it." Without thinking twice, Charles made the decision to take the dog with him. He welcomed him into his arms, feeling the weight of responsibility and at the same time, a strange sensation of hope invading his being. It was as if that unlikely encounter was a sign, a ray of light that penetrated the shadows of his lonely existence. With careful steps, Charles left the alley behind, carrying with him not only a lost dog, but also the promise of true friendship. He didn't know exactly what the future held for them, but he was determined to take care of that dog, as if he were his faithful confidant. The dog, in turn, looked at Charles with gratitude in his eyes, as if he understood the importance of that gesture of kindness. When they arrived at the apartment, Charles opened the door, revealing a modest but cozy space. He prepared a plate of food for the dog, watching it tenderly as the animal devoured the food greedily. It was a simple moment, but full of meaning. From that day on, Charles and the dog became inseparable. They explored the corners of the city together, walked through parks, and ventured on solitary walks. The dog, always faithful by his side, was a constant reminder that friendship and loyalty were still possible. The loneliness that had once been a constant presence in Charles now seemed to slowly dissipate. He began to rediscover joy in the little things in life. Charles smiled more often, his eyes sparkled with new energy, and his writing gained an emotional depth that he had previously lacked. The dog became his silent inspiration, which accompanied him on every written page. The connection between them was deep, as if their souls had found each other in the midst of the urban vastness. With his dog by his side, he wrote about his painful experiences, finding solace in the lines that came to life in his stories. The dog was his silent confidant, listening to every word with attentive eyes, as if he understood Charles's emotional journey. However, not everything is rosy. After 6 months of intense friendship, Charles received an overwhelming diagnosis. He was sitting in an office when his eyes met those of the doctor, whose face carried the gravity of worrying news. The words resonated in the air, echoing in the emptiness of the room and penetrating deep into his being. "Charles, I'm sorry to inform you, but you are facing a serious illness. It is at an advanced stage and requires immediate treatment." A storm of emotions stirred within Charles. The thin air of the office seemed to suffocate him as the doctor's words echoed in his mind. The future he had built, even in his solitude, was now crumbling before his eyes. Darkness and despair invaded his soul, and tears insisted on falling from his eyes. He felt an anguish so deep that it seemed to twist his heart. It was an agonizing feeling of powerlessness in the face of his own destiny. He couldn't believe his life was hanging by such a fragile thread. The doctor explained the necessary treatment, but the words seemed distant and meaningless to Charles. As soon as he got home, he grabbed his notebook and began frantically researching possible treatment options, renowned experts, and possibilities for a miracle cure. However, cruel reality set in, revealing the exorbitant costs of each alternative. The numbers danced before his eyes. The unreachable figures seemed to mock his condition. Charles felt helpless as the financial abyss opened before him. He was a talented writer, but his words seemed empty given the magnitude of his situation. The days that followed were a roller coaster of emotions. He found himself in a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, wavering between hope and despair. He was trapped by invisible walls, unable to escape the clutches of cruel fate. Charles regretted not having people close to him he could trust and turn to for support, but he had closed himself off to avoid further hurt, building a fortress around himself to protect his heart. Time now slipped like sand through his fingers, and the presence of the dog, his faithful friend, became even more essential. Those warm, loyal eyes looked at him with unwavering devotion, as if they knew something was wrong. The dog seemed to understand the pain coursing through Charles's veins, offering his silent love, like a balm for his tired soul. One Saturday morning, as his legs carried him toward the town's pharmacy, he found himself on a quiet, empty street, with tall buildings surrounding him like silent sentinels. It was then that his gaze strayed to a poster nailed to a nearby post. An image of a dog identical to his beloved companion was printed on that poster. The name Bob was written in big, bold letters. Charles stared at the poster with his eyes fixed, and his turbulent mind read every word written carefully. $20,000 reward for the dog, the ad said in bold letters. His legs felt shaky as he read that, as the internal struggle began to unfold. On the one hand, the financial offer was tempting. The aforementioned amount was more than enough to cover the exorbitant cost of his medical treatment. It was an opportunity to remove the shadows of the disease and bring a ray of hope for a more lasting life. The prospect of days without pain and the possibility of healing seemed so close, like a seductive promise that whispered in her ear. However, as he looked at the dog next to him, Charles's heart sank with a deep pain. Those loyal, trusting eyes seemed to reflect his own loneliness. The dog he had rescued from the streets and who had become his faithful companion now found himself at the center of a distressing dilemma. The walks through the city, the comforting hugs, the joyful games in the park, and every flash of happiness that Charles had experienced with the dog seemed to burn in his mind. He had found something true and precious, something that could not be measured in financial terms. A storm of thoughts and emotions collided in his tormented soul. He looked at the poster once more, studying the words intently. The reward could save his life, but at what cost? Would he be able to separate himself from his loyal companion, to exchange present happiness for uncertain hope? Charles closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to find the answer within himself. The voice of reason called for a pragmatic solution, while the echo of friendship and loyalty called him with an undeniable force. He knew the decision was his and his alone, and that it would have lasting consequences. Not knowing what to do, Charles wrote down the telephone number indicated on the poster and decided to wait until he got home to calmly reflect on that difficult situation. Bob was his confidant, his companion on lonely nights, the only one who understood him without a word needing to be said. Abandoning him in exchange for money would be like betraying the most precious friendship he had ever experienced. However, the need to pay for the treatment of his illness echoed incessantly in his mind. The medical bills piled up like a towering mountain in front of him, threatening to crush him under their overwhelming weight. Charles knew that time was running out, and that every day he went without proper treatment was one step closer to the abyss. Once at home, Charles caressed his great friend while trying to decide which choice to make. Bob was his only friend, his companion at all times, his most faithful confidant. With him, Charles could share his pains and secrets without the fear of rejection. Bob looked at him with a pious look, as if he wanted to convey a message of comfort to Charles. Tears began to cloud his vision as he tried to just weigh his options, weighing between the selfishness of saving himself and the unwavering loyalty to his faithful friend. Charles knew there was someone else out there, desperately looking for Bob. They could be grieving, wondering where their dog could be. But at the same time, he knew that Bob was fine and very happy by his side. Finally, with a tired sigh, Charles made a decision. There was no wealth that could replace the connection he had with Bob, the comforting warmth of her body beside him, and the look of understanding in his darkest moments. With a heavy heart but unwavering determination, Charles promised himself that he would find a way to pay for his treatment without giving up his faithful companion. He was willing to face the difficulties that presented themselves and to fight against the adversities that would come. But Charles could never imagine what was coming. Not everything went as he expected, and after being admitted to the hospital emergency room, suffering from severe headaches, Charles had to be hospitalized for 2 days. During his hospitalization, he was worried about his friend Bob. He wanted to leave to take care of the dog, but the doctors and nurses stopped him, saying it would be too big a risk for him to leave without finishing the medication. The 2 days seemed like an eternity to Charles, who couldn't wait to leave. As soon as he was discharged, an unexpected surprise happened. Bob was in front of the hospital and was waiting for him to leave. The dog was immensely happy to see Charles, just as he had been. Between hugs and sautéing the dog, the two loved each other. As they walked back home together, Charles began to reflect on everything that was happening. He loved Bob deeply, and because of that, he wanted the best for him. He knew that his illness was spreading rapidly, and it would be impossible to continue caring for Bob. He was no longer a man with energy and disposition, and his repeated trips to and from the hospital were leaving him exhausted. With a heavy heart and after much thought, Charles decided that the best thing to do was to return Bob. His heart beat wildly, with a mixture of anxiety and sadness, as he spoke on the phone with the real owner, giving him his address to pick up the dog. Augusto, Bob's real owner, excited by the news, arranged to pick him up that same afternoon. Charles knew that this would be the last time they would be together, and the pain of saying goodbye was already beginning to weigh heavily on his chest. With a heavy heart, he apologized to Bob for making that difficult choice. Tears fell tirelessly down his face as he sadly awaited Augustus' arrival. The man arrived punctually, looking distant and cold. It wasn't quite the person Charles imagined. With shaking hands, he handed Bob to Augusto and felt like he was giving away a part of himself. "Friend, you did the right thing by returning it," said Augusto. "He's been my pet dog for years, but lately he's been a burden as he keeps running away from home." A feeling of emptiness began to wash over him, and tears threatened to run down his cheeks. Augustus turned to Charles, but his words seemed distant, almost real. "Thanks for returning it," he said in an indifferent tone. "I'll deposit the money into his account as soon as I get home." Charles couldn't respond. His voice was caught in his throat, suffocated by the sadness that enveloped him. He watched Augusto get into the car, with Bob sitting in the seat, looking at him with a melancholy expression. And then the car left, taking with it not just a dog, but his best friend. Charles lay motionless on the sidewalk, heartbroken, and an overwhelming sense of loss. He felt empty, as if part of his soul had been ripped out. The decision to return Bob, even if out of necessity, now seemed like an impossible choice to bear. The days that followed were dark for Charles. Bob's absence made his loneliness unbearable. The empty corners of his house seemed to scream for his presence. He tried to fill the void with his written words, but his inspiration had disappeared along with his four-legged friend. As he anxiously awaited the promised reward, Charles felt consumed by uncertainty and disillusionment. Days turned into weeks, and the money that could have saved his life and provided the necessary medical treatment never arrived. His attempts to contact Augusto were in vain, with the phone number now being a deadline with no answers. The truth began to slowly reveal itself before his eyes, and he realized that Augustus had acted in bad faith. He couldn't believe that someone could be so cruel and so devoid of empathy. Bitterness took over Charles, mixing with his advanced illness. His life has become a mere countdown, a resigned wait for the inevitable to arrive. Within a few months, the disease completely consumed him. Charles died alone, in a hospital room, without friends or loved ones by his side. His silent departure was a tragic manifestation of his destiny, taking with him the pain and anguish that had marked his lonely existence. In the cold hospital corridors, the news of Charles's death echoed like a melancholy sigh. Few would remember him, and his story would be just one among many others. However, Charles's story lived on in Bob. The dog, now back in Augusto's hands, was never the same. An indescribable sadness filled his eyes, and an emptiness settled in his heart. Bob had known true friendship and the unconditional love that Charles offered him, and now he was struggling to live without his best friend, missing him intensely and painfully. Unfortunately, this story did not have a happy ending, and it makes us reflect on the fragility of human existence and the unpredictability of our destiny. Thanks for watching. Comment below what you thought of this story and which city you are watching us from. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so that together we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories. Until later.